This conference will now be recorded.
Good afternoon, all, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Jean Zanka. I am the immediate past chair of the Spinal Cord Injury Interdisciplinary Special Interest Group of ACRM, and I'm very glad you've joined us today for our webinar entitled Integrated Knowledge Translation and Consumer Engagement, a primer for rehabilitation researchers and clinicians. Before I introduce our guest speaker today, I have a few housekeeping announcements just to mention at the outset. One of them is that I request you stay on mute during the webinar, if at all possible, to minimize background noise. I do have the ability to mute lines if I hear anything, and we'll do that, but you always have the ability to unmute yourself to ask a question if you need to. I also request that you hold your questions until the end of our meeting. And at that time, as I said, you can unmute, or you can also use the chat box if you wish to be called on as well. So with that introduction, I am very glad to introduce our speaker for today. We will be hearing from John Chernesky, who is the lead of consumer engagement at the Praxis Spinal Cord Institute, formerly known as the Hansen Institute in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. He is also an executive council member of the North American Spinal Cord Injury Consortium, which brings together organizations and individuals interested in SCI to improve research, care, cure, and policies that affect the SCI community. And I had the great pleasure of meeting John at the SCI 2020 meeting that was hosted in the US in February of this year by the National Institutes of Health. And one of the key messages from that meeting was that there is a great need for us to involve the members of the SCI community more fully in our research efforts. And today's webinar is an effort to bring us closer to that goal. And so I'm very glad to have John here to share his expertise. And with that, I'm very glad to yield the floor. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Jean. That was a fantastic introduction and a great little segue to some of the stuff we'll talk about a little bit later in regards to the North American SCI Consortium and the NIH's SCI 2020 meeting back in February. So let's go ahead and we'll get started here. So today we're going to talk about integrated knowledge translation and how we can engage with people with lived experience of spinal cord injury throughout the research process. And again, yes, my name is John Chernesky, and I'm the consumer engagement lead here at the Praxis Spinal Cord Institute in Vancouver, British Columbia. So I'm going to just start off and give you a bit of background about my organization. You would have previously known us as the Hansen Institute. We've recently undergone a brand refresh, and we are now the Praxis Spinal Cord Institute. To give you a quick overview of some of the activities that we undertake, we are a research funder, so we do issue grants to researchers to undertake scientific research. We also have a registry, the Hansen Spinal Cord Injury Registry, with about 30 sites, acute and rehab in Canada, as well as sites in China, Israel, the Bay Area, Australia, and also in New Zealand. We also have data collection tools such as our global research platform. We have data support from our statistical team. We have a clinical team that works on best practice implementation and delivery of care. We have a commercialization team that looks at bringing new innovation and technology to market where it can have an impact on the people it was intended to. And of course, at the heart of it is the consumer engagement program. As I said, we were previously known as the Hansen Institute, founded by Rick Hansen, who's an individual with spinal cord injury. And so involving people with spinal cord injuries is really at the core of what we do, from the chair of our board and all the way down and throughout our organization. So in short, what do? We facilitate the translation of ideas into impact. And really, we're quite lucky with our funding through the Canadian federal government, as well as some other sources. It allows us to sort of try to fill the gaps in the research process that maybe other organizations aren't able to. And really, the term praxis really resonates with the work we do. It's an ancient Greek term, and really it's the process by which a theory, lesson, or skill is connected, embodied, or realized. So as a translational research organization, I think that really clearly describes the work that we do. And in short, what do? We try to accelerate the translation of discoveries and best practices into improved treatments for people with spinal cord injuries. And again, I guess you think, I think that maybe many of you have seen this before. This is the valleys of death model. The idea is that from basic discovery research, moving forward to clinical trial and clinical research, and out to everyday clinical practice, in those gaps between those phases of research, there are these two valleys of death where ideas often go to die. And those are the areas that we try to focus on to improve the translation of research from discovery to clinical research to clinical practice, and really trying to ensure that the work that researchers are doing actually gets to the point where it has an impact on those that it's served, and in a lot of cases that will be individuals living with spinal cord injuries. We have 4 core programs. We obviously are working on trying to accelerate curative therapies in spinal cord injury. We're also looking at people who are incurring spinal cord injuries right now and trying to ensure that they're receiving the best possible care from the moment they're injured right through in their acute and rehab stays and out into the community and ongoing. I mentioned our commercialization program, as well as our consumer program. I won't go into too much details there. So I've said that term a few times. What is a consumer? A consumer, we like to use the term, I think we're transitioning towards the term of PLEX, which is an acronym for Persons with Lived Experience of Spinal Cord Injury. And we like to think that a spinal cord injury doesn't just affect the individual who's enduring the spinal cord injury, it also affects their entire support structure around them. So it affects individuals with spinal cord injury as well as their family and friends, their carers, as well as community organizations and advocacy organizations that support people throughout their journey following spinal cord injury. So whenever you hear me use the term consumer, you can think that I'm referring to persons with lived experience and including not just the individuals, but all of the other key stakeholders in their lives. So for those of you who may not be very familiar with spinal cord injury, I'm going to assume that most of the people on this webinar are, but I'm just going to hit this slide real quick and talk about the cost and the impact of spinal cord injury. The spinal cord injury, would say, is one of the most traumatic injuries that the human body can endure and still continue to live. It affects almost every system in the entire body. And it's, obviously the mobility restriction is obviously the most visual, but if you ask people living with spinal cord injuries, it's these other issues that tend to be much more important to them as they move on throughout their life following spinal cord injury, including bowel and bladder and sexual dysfunctions, respiratory compromise, cardiovascular compromise, autonomic dysfunctions overall, including dysreflexia, instability and reduced upper extremity function, as well as some other secondary issues such as neuropathic pains, spasticity, pressure injury, bladder infection, respiratory infections. So it can have a huge impact on the individual, and that impact is also felt by the health delivery healthcare systems. These statistics you're seeing here are based on Canadian data. We look at about 2.7 billion Canadian dollars annually is the burden of traumatic spinal cord injury in Canada, and that's only about 50% of new injuries, because according to our data, about 50% are non-traumatic injury, and then you have some financial burden on those secondary complications, pressure injuries, urinary tract infections, neuropathic pain, pneumonia. It all adds up to a huge cost on the healthcare system and a huge impact on individuals that are living with spinal cord injury. So I mentioned previously that we're a translational research organization, and that's really looking at how do we move and close the gaps from knowledge to practice. Knowledge translation was defined by Dr. Ian Graham just over a decade ago as a dynamic and iterative process that includes the synthesis, dissemination, and exchange of ethically sound application of knowledge to improve health and health services. I think we're all quite familiar with this, and a lot of research grant applications ask for your knowledge translation plan and how you're going to get this knowledge out to the community. And often that includes journal publications and conference presentations and such. And this is great. I think it's important to ensure that people are very considerate about how this knowledge that is being generated is going to be disseminated and shared and learned throughout the entire research ecosystem and care delivery ecosystem. But we're trying to move one step forward, one step further to what we're calling integrated knowledge translation. And we define that as the meaningful engagement of the right research users at the right time throughout the research process. And really it's about stakeholder engagement. It's about finding who those right research users are. As you'll see in that definition, it doesn't mention person with spinal cord injury, it doesn't mention consumer, it mentions the right research user. And so that really, I think, puts the onus on researchers to think about who is going to be the users of this knowledge and how can we engage with them and bring them into this work in a meaningful way to help make it more impactful when we get to the end of the research cycle. Again, this is the team that's been working on developing these integrated knowledge translation. We're working to create some guiding principles. I'll touch base on that a little bit more, but I just wanted to acknowledge Dr. Heather Gainforth and the team that's developing these integrated knowledge translation guiding principles. But we'll touch base on that a bit more as a quick definition of meaningful engagement. But I don't think we need to go into too much detail about that right now. So why are we talking about integrated knowledge translation and why are we talking about knowledge translation in general? This is a quick model of what the traditional research system works. And it looks like you write a grant, you get some money, you do some research, and you publish your results. And as a result of publishing results, which is often called the currency of researchers, is academic publication, you can then therefore use that publication to write more grants and get more money and do more research. In the end, there's no mention of impact. What is that knowledge going to do to change the lives of the people that it was intended to assist? So this is why we suggest that we practice integrated knowledge translation. When you bring in the key stakeholders who are going to be taking up the mantle of that knowledge once you've finished creating it, they can help push it towards more impact. And it comes back to the basic principle that those affected by a decision have a right to be a part of the decision-making process. In North America, we're lucky enough to live in democratic countries where we get to vote for our leaders and have a say in our society. And I don't think that should be, that research should be exclusive of that. I think that if this research is intended to impact people living with spinal cord injuries, then people with spinal cord injuries should be able to have an influence on what that research looks like. In short, it's quite simple, nothing about us without us. And there has been some evidence that's been developed around engagement in research, and it's been shown, sorry, I need to fix that terminology, not proven. I've been told by some people that research never proves anything, it just shows things. Anyways, shown to increase study enrollment rates, aid in securing funding, and improve study design, protocols, and choice of relevant outcome measures, all hugely beneficial to any research project. So as I mentioned there, it aids in securing funding. What we're seeing is that more and more frequently, health research funders are requiring that persons with lived experience of that health condition be partners in research teams. This is just a small sampling of some research funders from around the world who are asking for their research research proposals to be done in a patient-partnered or patient-centered model. Right in the center there, you'll see the Department of Defense's CDMRP, their spinal cord injury research program. When they launched their request for proposals earlier this year, they mandated that every proposal be done in a patient-partnered model. And so it's exciting from our perspective to see funders moving towards this sort of model in research. But I think there's some challenges that we're facing, and we'll get into that a little bit more. But again, this I think is the way of the future. It's not happening in small pockets. It's happening around the world. The funders are demanding it more and more. So I think this is an opportunity for persons with lived experience and researchers and clinicians to find ways to work together effectively and meaningfully to help push research forward further. So this is a small graphic that shows the research cycle. We start off by creating a question. Then once we've got this question, we ask for some money to explore this question. If we receive this funding, then we develop some methods around what this research is going to look like. We then conduct the research, we analyze the data and publish it, and then we look to disseminate it broadly. What ends up happening though is traditionally we would see researchers reaching out to individuals with spinal cord injury and community organizations at that last phase, at the dissemination phase. They'd reach out to a variety of organizations and say, look at this wonderful knowledge that I've created. Now you guys take it and get it funded, get it implemented, make it happen. And that, in a lot of ways, was very tokenistic. Now that funders are starting to demand patient partners on funding applications, we're oftentimes seeing tokenism happen at 2 points, where people are not a part of defining the research question. They're just reached out to by a researcher saying, look, here's this research that I want to do. I need a patient partner. You sign off on this and I'll submit it and I'll get my money. And then I'm going to do all the other phases of the research. I'll probably get back to you at the dissemination phase. But overall, you're not really going to have much of a say in what we're going to be doing. So when I look at this, I see all these areas for growth. I think that these are the areas where we need to bring lived experience and key stakeholders into the research cycle to create this model of integrated knowledge translation, where people are meaningfully engaged throughout the entire research process, not just at key points where people feel it's easiest or it's required. Again, we touch on this idea of tokenism. I think people are familiar with it, but we just want to really try to drive this home that tokenism occurs when a person with a spinal cord injury or an organization is asked to endorse and therefore legitimize research programs over which they have little real control. I don't know if we want to use that word control. Maybe influence is a better way to describe it. But I think that there's opportunities for partnership and engagement where you can engage with these key stakeholders and have a meaningful dialogue and look at the expertise that they have of living with a spinal cord injury and how that is compatible with a researcher's expertise or a clinician's expertise to create a much more robust picture of the question that's trying to be answered. So how do we do this? How do we engage with people? It's probably the question I get asked the most is, well, I understand that, this is maybe the right thing to do, or that this is what funders are requiring, or this is what the community is asking for, but how do I do it? This here is a great tool that you can use. It's created by an organization called the International Association of Public Participation. And again, it's public participation. This is not isolated to a research world, but it works in a whole host of areas. And it's about how do you consult with your stakeholders? How do you engage with them? And in this model, it shows 5 different levels of engagement, from informing all the way through to empowering. When I first learned about this document, I thought it was fantastic, this tool. But okay, there we go. We had a bit of feedback there. If anybody's on the call and you're not speaking, if you just want to self-mute yourself, that'll hopefully avoid any of that feedback or background noise. Anyways, when I first saw this tool, I immediately gravitated towards collaborate and empower, because I thought, if we move towards there, then that's better than just informing. But over the years, I've come to realize that each of these is equally beneficial. And at different points throughout the research process, They all have their own strengths. So no particular level of engagement, I feel, is better than any other. It's that they're appropriate at different phases. If we think about that wheel of research, the circle that I showed you previously, perhaps when it comes to defining what the research question is, you may want to collaborate with a person with lived experience to, you've got an idea in your head about a research project or a research idea or a novel question, but you're not entirely sure if it's meaningful to people with spinal cord injuries. So maybe you reach out to somebody and you go, look, this is an idea that I have. What do you think? And you work with them in a collaborative fashion to refine that research question to create a question that's meaningful for them. And then, when it gets to the funding application, well, maybe they're not that experienced at developing funding applications. Maybe you just want to involve them, and particularly perhaps in the engagement plan and how you're going to plan the engagement activities within this funding proposal. When you get to developing the methods, maybe they've participated in hundreds of research studies or even a handful, and they've had experience in some studies that were really easy to participate in and some that were more burdensome. And maybe they can provide you some great input, maybe again back at a collaborative level, on ways you can design your research protocol that's going to make it attractive and easy for persons to participate in, which in the end is only going to make recruitment easier for you. But then you get to conducting the research. And perhaps they don't want to be a part of that. They don't want to be in the lab doing data collection with your research subjects, and perhaps there's some ethical issues involved there. So maybe at that point, you just want to inform them, keep them up to date on how activities are going. They don't need to know every last detail of what's happening, but you can, shoot them an email every now and then and say, this is where we're going along, things are on track, or maybe we've had to change tactics a little bit. You never know, every individual is going to be different. You have to discuss with them what's going to be meaningful for them and what's going to work best for them. And you move on to analyzing the data and publishing. Maybe they want to be involved in that. Maybe they're going to see the data and interpret it in a way that maybe you didn't see. And so maybe involving them at that level can help to make the results and the analyzing of the data, again, more meaningful and more impactful to the SCI community. And who knows, when you get to disseminate, maybe you want to collaborate. Maybe you want to be up on stage together, co-presenting your findings and co-writing journal publications to share that knowledge and trying to move it towards impact and implementation. Anyway, so I'll move on from here, but it's a great tool. I suggest you guys keep that one on hand. This is another great tool. Again, this is showing that wheel. This is a little postcard that myself and a few others created for the ISFOS conference in Sydney last year. And this is really created as a stopgap, as a tool that researchers can use in the interim while we're developing these guiding principles. And again, it shows some methodologies that can be used, a couple of do's and don'ts, as well as some links to some online resources that I'll show you again later. There's a link at the bottom of this slide. We're going to be sharing the slides on the ACRM website, so if you miss it here, you can always find it online later, and it'll show you where you can access some of these resources. So the do's and don'ts, again, engage broadly. If you've met one person with spinal cord injury, you've met one person with a spinal cord injury. Spinal cord injury is highly heterogeneous. No two injuries are the same and no two individuals are the same. If it's within your capacity to bring in more than one individual, to bring in a few different people with different perspectives, I highly recommend it. And that will help you to avoid tokenism. Set clear expectations, be aware of power dynamics. Oftentimes, an individual with a spinal cord injury may have a huge amount of knowledge of living with that spinal cord injury. Myself, I've had one for 26 years, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 26 years. That's a huge amount of expertise living with spinal cord injury. But I'm not a PhD. I don't understand the research process or some of the minutiae details of spinal cord research that a researcher may. And so there may be a feeling of imbalance of, whose knowledge is more valuable in this partnership, in this team. And there's ways to address that and ensure that everybody's expertise is valued equally. Again, I think another element is to build capacity. People with spinal cord injuries do have that expertise of living with spinal cord injury, though they may not have expertise in clinical application of knowledge or in research and research process and protocols. And there's an opportunity for sharing that knowledge where people with spinal cord injuries can provide their knowledge to you, and you can provide your knowledge to them in a co-learning environment. And again, remember that everybody has ownership. I won't beat that into the ground. You can find the postcard and develop your own understanding of this. So let's get into a couple of tools real quick. This is a great tool that's been created by the George and Fay Yee Center for Healthcare Innovation. It's their, oh geez, sorry, I forgot the name of the tool. It doesn't matter. I'm sure you guys can find it online anyways. When you go to this website, links in the bottom corner there, it will bring you to a neat little tool, and you see this series of nodes that are down the side of your screen. If you look at this, this is just another way of looking at that research wheel, where we're looking at, identifying and prioritizing, designing, getting funding, data collection, analysis, implementation, all of the various phases of research that we're familiar with. If you look at any particular one of those phases and you click on that node, it will expand, and it will show you a series of other nodes. And again, we look at that IAP2 spectrum that we spoke about earlier, and talking about consult, collaborate, or what they call patient or public directed, which I would refer to also as empowering. And if you click on one of those, say at the collaborate level, it will open up a series of options for you. Charrettes, study circles, participatory design, or patient journey mapping. And these are various methodologies that you can use to engage for these various sorts of phases of the research process. And if you click on any one of those, I think in this model we've clicked on participatory design, it will link you to a full explanation of what participatory design is, as well as a full explanation of how you can undertake it, and some references to other tools and resources that will explain to you how to do it in a step-by-step fashion to ensure that you're undertaking these particular activities in the appropriate way. So again, when people ask me, well, how do I do it? There we go. We've shown you a few different tools that provide step-by-step instruction on how to undertake these activities. Another fantastic tool is the Engage 2020 Action Catalog. This is a tool developed in Europe, funded by the European Commission. Fantastic tool. Again, quite similar to the one I just showed you, but visually very different. This one's very attractive. Down the left-hand column there, you'll see a series of tick boxes that you can tick on dependent on the particular activity that you want to undertake. And when you tick on them, these brightly colored circles will start to shift and change. So as I've ticked there, I've included research activity at a collaborate level in a regional scope. And you can see those circles have sort of shifted and pivoted, and some have grown and some have contracted. As you move down, you start to add in who your participants in this particular activity are going to be, what sort of skills are required. And you can see, again, those circles have shifted and changed again to really sort of highlight to you which particular engagement activities are best suited to your particular needs given the criteria that you've selected. I think in this model, we've clicked on the World Cafe, and if you were to click on World Cafe, again, it will bring you to a very robust description of what a World Cafe is, how it can be undertaken, some of the evidence supporting this particular activity, as well as other resources you can use. It's a fantastic tool, and again, it can be found at actioncatalog.eu. So again, it provides these step-by-step instructions where it really does make it quite easy to undertake these activities. And these aren't the only ones that are out there. There's a lot more coming online all the time. Organizations like CORI and CIHR have created a lot of fantastic tools. The next question I often get asked is, okay, so I understand that the funders are requiring it. I understand that people with lived experience are asking for it. And I have a feeling that this is the right way to go. Now you've shown me some tools on how to do it, but I don't know anybody with a spinal cord injury. I don't know how to connect with them. Where do I find them? Who's the right person to do this? And we found that this was a bit of a growing problem. I would suggest that probably the best place to connect with people with spinal cord injuries, if you don't have any direct connection, is through community organizations. Organizations like United Spinal, like Spinal Cord Injury Canada and its provincial organizations. And these community organizations exist all around the world. In Europe, you have the European Spinal Cord Injury Federation. In Australasia, you have the Australian-New Zealand Spinal Cord Injury peer organizations. So, there are community organizations all around the world. And what we found in North America is that although there's a lot of organizations, we wanted to create a mechanism for them to get together and sort of have a unified voice in engaging with researchers, research funders, regulatory agencies. And so a couple of years ago, we got together and formed the North American Spinal Cord Injury Consortium. And it brings together like-minded organizations, individuals, and groups to improve research, care, cure, and policies impacting people living with spinal cord injuries, their families, and communities. So we have three types of, three levels of membership. We have members which are organizations who are focused, nonprofit organizations whose primary focus is on people with spinal cord injuries. Again, individuals with lived experience of spinal cord injury. And we've also got a third category of membership where we invite researchers, research institutions, industry, and various other organizations to come in and be a part of the consortium. They're non-voting members. This again is a consortium by people with spinal cord injury for people with spinal cord injury, but we really do actively encourage your involvement and your input to help us better understand how we can do our work better to support your activities and work together, again, in an integrated knowledge translation model. There you've got a list of the members of the Executive Council, headed up by Kim Anderson and Jen French. If you don't know Kim and Jen, they are absolute dynamos and really the driving force behind the creation of the consortium and have really been absolutely key in moving this organization forward to have the impact that it has in its short period of existence. We've recently actually just had our annual meeting just about a month ago, and there's a few of us that are going to be stepping off the Executive Council, so I don't know if they're on the call or on the webinar right now, but we have two new members who just today will be moving on, Jennifer Wolf and Taryn Clark. Will be joining the Executive Council. So again, trying to increase capacity by taking some of those individuals who have that experience on the Executive Council and they're stepping down. And we're going to be bringing in some new individuals who have perhaps different perspectives and different experiences to really help move the organization forward. So what does the organization do? We really are at the core of our work right now focused on patient-partnered projects. Looking at that integrated knowledge translation model. So this is just a short list of some of the projects that we're involved in now. There's new ones coming online all the time. And you can see from the partners that we've got, you've got some big names in there. You've got Cleveland FES, you've got ICORD, you've got NIH, Praxis as well, the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control. So again, we're getting asked by some really big names in research and healthcare delivery to help have a voice in helping to shape the future of spinal cord injury research. And if you've got a project where you'd like to get involved, you can always get in touch with us. The procedure for proposing a project partnership with NASCIC is all found on our website. Earlier, Jean mentioned the NIH SCI 2020 meeting that was held earlier this year in Bethesda. This was really a fantastic meeting by the NIH. They really wanted to sort of look at the current state of spinal cord injury research and help to set the agenda for their funding moving forward. And they reached out to us at NASCIC and asked us to be a part of this meeting. There were 6 panel presentations over a couple of days, and one of those was led by the North American SCI Consortium. And so they reached out to us and they asked us to provide our consumer input on what's going on currently in spinal cord injury research and what the future might look like. And we thought, well, that's fantastic. But as you saw in our Executive Council, there was only 7 or 8 of us there. And that really wasn't a broad representation of the community. There's a much larger community beyond that And so we took this as an opportunity to really see what the strength of the NASCIC network was. And so we reached out to our network. We did a survey through our organization members to ask what they thought on a series of questions in regards to spinal cord injury research involvement. And we got a huge response. In just over a month, we had over 1,800 respondents to this survey, and the survey data is available on the NASCIC website. And what you'll see is that overwhelmingly, people with spinal cord injury felt that they weren't involved in the research process, that they want to increase their knowledge of research and research processes, that they want to be involved in helping to set the priorities of research, and they want to be involved in designing projects. Amongst a whole host of other things, you can go to the website and find all the data. But really resoundingly, what we heard from the community is that they're interested in research, they want to know more about research, and they want to help advance it towards improving the lives of people with spinal cord injury. So really what that sounds to me is it's a hugely untapped resource. There's a huge amount of expertise in people with spinal cord injury, not just that lived experience, but there's secondary knowledge. A lot of people with spinal cord injury are PhD researchers, but there's also people that have other expertise in a whole host of other areas that can really help to strengthen research teams. Again, another project that we've been heavily involved with is the creation of the Spinal Cord Injury Trials, SCI Trials website. This was another issue that we talk about is recruitment for SCI Trials. So this is a fantastic project led by Naal Al-Assad from the UK in partnership with NASCIC and a variety of other partners. Again, it looks at all the various ongoing trials that are out there and makes it really easy for people to search through. They can find out what their injury level is, they can figure out what their severity of injury is, and by entering a couple of quick place elements, including their location, it will provide them an easily searchable list of all the various trials that they're eligible to participate with, and again, help them find a way to connect with the researchers that are conducting it. So again, trying to ease the challenges of recruitment. If you have a trial that you're running and it's not on SCItrials.org, you can go to the website and get in contact with the organizer, the creators, who will then upload your trial to their database. So that's something I wanted to pitch there. Okay, so let's get into some of the practical aspects of engagement. So I know I'm going a bit fast, but I'm trying to keep on time. Budgeting is something that also comes up as a big question. I always recommend that you budget for your engagement activities. Engagement is not free. The statistics say that unemployment amongst persons with disabilities is bordering around 70%. That's no different for persons with spinal cord injury. So when you think about the engagement activities and the sort of onus that it puts on an individual and the time that they're putting in, there needs to be compensation for that effort. Experience creates expertise, and expertise needs to be compensated for. I can tell you this, that appropriate engagement budgeting strengthens your funding application. I have spoken to a multitude of funders, and they always say that when they look at a budget in a funding application, a robust engagement budget that explains quite clearly what activities you want to undertake, who you want to undertake them with, how much time it's going to take, and what it's going to cost, that strengthens your application. It doesn't weaken it. And this is an area of a budget within a funding application that funders have said unanimously they would never cut. So I do recommend that you think about the work that your patient partners will be undertaking and budget appropriately for it. And consider things like hours of expected work, the prep, the meetings, the homework, travel expenses, dissemination activities, as well as considering the secondary experience of these individuals above and beyond just their lived experience with a spinal cord injury. If you've got some, if you're still a little confused by it, again, you can go to the NASCIC website, and I believe there's some tools available there with some templates that can show you what you can do to budget, create an appropriate budget for your work. I mentioned previously capacity building. I think that these ideas of engagement, it's a whole new world. This is something that hasn't been undertaken previously. It's going to take learning from all stakeholders, not just researchers and clinicians, but also from people with spinal cord injury and funders and regulatory bodies and reimbursers. I think we all need to understand how this is going to work in practice. We're learning as we go. There are some curriculums available. CIHR, the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, has developed their strategy for patient-oriented research, and they have a curriculum that they have developed. The European Patients Academy has a very robust one, as well as some that have been developed outside of research, like the Rick Hansen Foundation's Accessible Design Certification. NASCIC has explored developing a curriculum and trying to increase capacity. I'm not entirely sure where we're at with that, but hopefully in the near future, we may be able to move forward with something like that. And as I said, it's not just about putting the onus on researchers and on clinicians. There's a need for persons with spinal cord injury to up their game as well. For anybody that's on the webinar right now that is living with spinal cord injury or has that lived experience, you know, there's a need for us to better understand research process so that we can make those meaningful contributions. You know, there's a need to better understand the abilities and limitations of research. And I think that there's an opportunity for researchers to help provide that education to persons with lived experience so that they can better understand how research works, while the people with lived experience are helping researchers to better understand what it's like to live with spinal cord injury. And again, I think I'll just sort of wrap up now. I think I'm doing pretty good on time. Just wanted to make you guys aware that there are development of the Integrated Knowledge Translation Guiding Principles. This is a project led by Dr. Heather Gainforth. She's a principal investigator at ICORD in Kelowna at the UBC Okanagan. These are the first guiding principles for conducting integrated knowledge translation in SCI. This has been done in a very, very robust manner. Started with a review of reviews, moved on to a scoping review, key informant interviews, a Delphi process, and just a couple of weeks ago, we held our agreed to consensus meeting. I think you saw a photo earlier of some of the people that were involved in that. We have now come to consensus on what these guiding principles will look like. Again, we're just doing some final wordsmithing, as well as preparing some publications. Once, hopefully, those publications go through, or those articles go through peer review and get accepted, once that has hopefully happened, we will then be able to share them publicly, and we're hoping to be able to share them in Q1 or Q2 of 2020. So that's certainly something to look out for. Following the development of the launch of the guidelines, we will be developing a very robust toolkit for researchers and clinicians and persons with spinal cord injury to use in helping to guide their activities in integrated knowledge translation activities. So something to keep your eye out for in the future. And again, I'm just going to finish off with engage early and engage often. You know, it's never too early to start developing those relationships with people with spinal cord injuries. Oftentimes people say to me, well, how am I meant to develop a meaningful partnership when I have a 3-week window from the announcement of a funding ask to the submission of my protocol or my proposal? You know, and that is a challenge. Funders often give very tight timelines on when the actual funding is announced and when you need to submit your proposal. So if you know some persons with spinal cord injury, or even if you don't, maybe it's a good opportunity to reach out and start to develop those relationships. Find people who have common interests in your research. You know, myself, I deal with a fair amount of muscle spasticity. And so if a researcher reaches out to me and says, hey, I want to do a study on spasticity, I've got a lot of experience in that area. But neuropathic pain isn't really something I deal with. So if a researcher asks me to deal with neuropathic pain, I don't think I'd be a very good partner on that because I'm not familiar. So, you know, if you've got an area of expertise that you work in, it's a good idea to try to find some individuals with spinal cord injury who have a similar interest, who want to be a part, start to develop those relationships, start to figure out which questions are meaningful to them, so that when those RFPs come out, you've got those inbuilt relationships, you've got a team that's almost ready to go, and you can get those proposals together and submitted in a meaningful way right off the hop. Anyways, I think we're right about on time. I think we can move to questions here, and if you want to reach out to me, that's how you can reach me. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks so much, John. That was a wonderful presentation. I know there are many things, many resources there I did not know existed that I'm really glad you shared. So we're grateful for that. And at this point, if anyone wishes to ask a question, you're welcome to unmute your line and ask that. So I'll give you a moment to think about that. And we'll go from there. While other folks are thinking, John, I appreciated what you said about the members of the SCI community saying that they really would like to learn more about research so as to be more informed participants in the process of interfacing with researchers and contributing to what questions they may have. What suggestions do you have for us? You know, for example, we have a local community advisory board here as part of our SCI Research Center, but we've not really undertaken any kind of tutorial or review of what the research project entails, and there could be opportunities to do that. What suggestions do you have for how to educate our identified advisors about this topic?
Yeah, you know, again, I think you can maybe take a quick look at some of the curriculums that are out there. Mm-hmm. But I think, you know, it's really, start simple, don't get too complicated, maybe like a research 101. You know, if you think about, you know, what could you share in an hour or two to make them understand, you know, the research process, the cycles, the timelines, the constraints, you know, why we have to do, you know, controls, why we have to do, you know, different research protocols, like say like an ABAB, to try to show evidence of change and effect, you know, cause and effect. You know, just because I think that some of these concepts are a bit foreign to non-researchers. You know, and I think, you know, there's an opportunity to share that knowledge and then, you know, reach out to your advisory board following that and say, okay, so we gave you just a small sampling and overview. Is there any particular areas that you want to get in a little more in depth in? You know, I think that this is an area that myself and I think the consortium have really recognized as an area that needs some work in trying to figure out what skills patient partners will need and developing a curriculum to provide that for them. So yeah, it's a very good question, but I would start with the basics and sort of dive deeper as you go along.
Sounds good. Very good. All right.
Yeah. Another question that I get asked is, you know, well, this works really good in clinical research where you're working, you know, hands-on with people with spinal cord injury and you can understand how it's going to affect them and shape their work. But how do I do it if I'm a basic scientist? You know, what do I do if my research is you know, looking at stuff in a petri dish? And I think when we get back to that idea of knowledge translation, you know, I think it's perhaps asking, is this question meaningful to people with spinal cord injury? And is this going to translate to something down the line that people will actually be able to use? So a couple examples are some of these hyperacute trials where they're looking at neuroprotection, you know, and they're looking at an animal model of, you know, 2 hours post-injury, which maybe translates to a human to 12 hours. You know, if you ask most people with spinal cord injury, a lot of times they weren't at a specialized hospital within 12 hours. So how's that actually going to translate to clinical practice? You know, and thinking about things like that. Again, maybe persons with spinal cord injury aren't your key stakeholders. Maybe while you're working at that early phase of the preclinical research, maybe your key stakeholder is the next person down the line before you even get to a clinical study. So, you know, really thinking about who the key stakeholders are. Another example was talking about microbiome research was recently discussed at the ISCOS meeting a few weeks back. And I had a great question about, well, how does that actually translate into my day-to-day use? And the researcher said, you know, that's a really great question. You know, we're at this early phase and we're thinking about how we're going to translate that, but we never thought about, you know, is this person going to chronically need to take antibiotics, probiotics to maintain a healthy biome, and how's that going to work in day-to-day use? So it's about, you know, thinking about from an end user's perspective how they're going to adapt that knowledge or that change in practice. You know, even in basic science, there is an opportunity.
Very good. All right. Well, thank you so much again, John, for sharing your expertise today. If anyone else has a question they'd like to ask, you're welcome to interrupt at any moment and do that. But in parting, I'll just say that we were very honored as the Spinal Cord Injury Interdisciplinary Special Interest Group to be able to host this webinar today. And if anyone who is attending the call is interested in learning more about our activities, I encourage you to visit the ACRM website, where you'll find links to all the different activities and communities there. And also you can reach out to our membership officer, Catherine Vandewerker, and her email's there, and she's happy to answer any questions you might have and help connect you to task forces and other activities that may be of interest to you. So with that, I will close and thank everyone for their participation.
Thank you so much for having me, Gina. I really appreciate the opportunity.
We're very glad. Thanks again.